review of the cardiovascular system. If you look at your screen, you can see the figure of the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system comprises of the heart and the vessels. And you can see that the heart has two parts, the right heart shown in blue and the left heart shown in red. The right heart is connected with the veins, and it receives the venous blood from the body. The different veins, they are shown. Blood from the upper part of the body reaches the right heart through the superior vena cava, and blood from the lower part of the body reaches the heart through the inferior vena cava. Then the right heart will pump this blood to the lungs. The deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs where it gets oxygenated, and then it is returned to the left heart through the pulmonary veins, and the left heart then pumps it into the circulation through the aorta, and through different branches of the aorta it is distributed to the entire body. Next. Now the first organ system to develop in the body is the cardiovascular system, or the circulatory system. Why does this system develop so early? It is because that initially the nutritional requirements of the embryo, they are met through simple diffusion of blood between the germ layers and the maternal blood. But as the developmental process continues, the nutritional requirements, they increase, and they cannot be met by simple diffusion. Therefore, God has created this system that the cardiovascular system begins to develop in the middle of the third week, and it becomes functional by the end of the third week. Next. Now the development of the primitive cardiovascular system, the first structure to develop are the blood vessels, and the blood vessels, they first form in the extra embryonic tissues, that is in the yolk sac, wall of the yolk sac, in the body stalk, and in the chorion. The vessels which develop in the yolk sac, they are called the vitelline vessels. The vessels which develop in the body stalk, they are called the umbilical vessels, and those which develop in the chorion, they are called the placental vessels. And the process begins in the intraembryonic tissues 2 days later. Next. Now this figure shows the development of how the blood vessels are formed. If you concentrate on this black and white figure labeled as A, B, C, and D, you will see that the first step is that there is proliferation of the mesenchymal cells, which are destined to form blood vessels, and they form aggregates of cells, and these are called the blood islands or blood clusters. Then some of the cells, they become flattened. The next step is that a cavity appears in them. There are first there is a proliferation of cells forming aggregate of cells. Then spaces appear within these cells, and these spaces coalesce to form a single cavity. The cells which line the cavity, they become flattened, and they form the endothelial cells. And some of the cells, they detach and they come to lie within the cavity, and they form the primitive blood cells. Later on, the adjacent blood islands, they communicate with each other, and this way they form capillary vessels. Next. Now these capillary vessels, they approach each other and they form, if you see in this figure, the lower part of the figure, the third diagram, these are the endothelial cells, and at the center are the primitive blood cells, and the endothelial cells, the endothelial tubes are formed and forming a network of capillaries, and this is the first step in the formation of the blood vessels. Next. The intra-embryonic vessels, they develop by day 18, between the days 18 to 20. In a similar fashion, endothelial tube network appears. By the end of the third week, the intra-embryonic and the extra-embryonic endothelial tube networks connect to each other to form a diffuse endothelial tubular network. So I'll summarize it. The first step was that the formation, the proliferation of the mesenchymal cells, the angiogenic mesenchymal cells. Angiogenic means those cells which are destined to form the cardiovascular system. These angiogenic cells, they form cell clusters, then spaces appear between these cells. Those spaces coalesce to form a central cavity. Some of the cells, they detach and come to lie within the cavity. These cells will form the primitive blood cells. The cells lining the cavities, they will flatten to form the endothelial cells. Now the adjacent blood islands, the structure which are formed, they are called blood islands. Now the adjacent blood islands, they communicate with each other, forming endothelial tubes. Then by the end of the third week, the endothelial tubular network, which is formed in the extra-embryonic tissues and the extra-embryonic tissues, they communicate with each other. Thus, a primitive circulation of blood begins within the embryo, the extra-embryonic tissues and the intra-embryonic tissues. Next. Now, the primitive cardiovascular system that is formed, it comprises of a heart tube. Initially, the heart tube is paired. Later on, the two tubes fuse to form a single tube. The tube attached to this tube are a number of arteries and veins. The arteries, they are the dorsal aorta, the tubes which are formed, they are the arterial side includes the dorsal aorta, the vitelline artery, the umbilical artery, and the aortic arches. Now, if you look at the figure, this is the this is the developing heart. These are the aortic arches. This red one running across the entire length of the embryo is the dorsal aorta, and this one is the umbilical artery. The vitelline artery, and this one is the umbilical artery. Then there are three sets of veins. One is the common cardinal veins, which empty blood into the right heart, and each common cardinal vein is formed by the union of anterior cardinal vein and the posterior cardinal vein. The anterior cardinal vein carries blood from the upper parts of the body and posterior from the lower parts of the body. The other veins, they are the vitelline vein and the umbilical vein, which communicate with the cardinal veins.
सर थ्रू कर्सर
जी क्या चीज
कर्सर के थ्रू सर ये सब हमारे उस पर कर्सर नहीं।
मुझे आपकी बात की समझ नहीं आई
सर। आपका कर्सर दिखाई नहीं दे रहा, ना ही मूव हो रहा है।
अच्छा, मैं कर्सर आपको जो है तो अब नजर आ रहा है कर्सर?
यस सर।
अच्छा, ये अभी
Yes,
जिस जगह
sir.
पे कर्सर है, दिस इज द डॉर्सल एओर्टा। ठीक है, ये जो लंबी है, लंबी रेड वेसल है running throughout the length of the embryo, this is the dorsal aorta and these are paired। इस फिगर में तो एक बताई हुई है, these are paired dorsal aortae। फिर ये जो रेड है which is going into the yolk sac, this is the vitelline artery। then this is the umbilical cord and the vessel, red colored vessel going into it is the umbilical artery। क्लियर? समझ आई कि नहीं?
यस सर।
अच्छा, फिर वेन्स पे आ जाएं तो ये आप देख लें, एंटीरियर कार्डिनल वेन जो अपर पार्ट ऑफ द बॉडी से ला रही है ब्लड, ये पोस्टीरियर कार्डिनल वेन जो लोअर पार्ट ऑफ बॉडी से ला रही है। देन इज द कॉमन कार्डिनल वेन जो इन दोनों के मिलने से बन रही है, एंड द कॉमन कार्डिनल वेन इज आल्सो रिसीविंग द अम्बिलिकल वेन एंड द वेटलाइन वेन। Actually, these veins they open separately into the sinus venosus, जो आगे मैं आपको आगे बताऊंगा। So the venous blood is being brought by three sets of veins: the common cardinal veins, the umbilical vein, and the vitelline vein। ये दूसरे स्क्रीन पे भी मैं बता देता हूँ। This is the common cardinal vein, this is the umbilical vein, and this is the vitelline vein। And this is the animation of the heart pumping। The process begins by day 18 and is complete by day 21 or 22. The heart begins to pump, although the pumping at that time is not like this as shown in the figure, that is somewhat peristaltic movement। अच्छा, अब इस उसमें जो है सबसे स्टेप वाइज वही है। अब डेवलपमेंट ऑफ हार्ट होगी कहाँ पे? The development of the heart begins in the septum transversum। What is septum transversum? The unsplit mesenchyme at the cranial end of the embryonic disc is called the septum transversum। Within the septum transversum, जिस तरह ब्लड वेसल्स बनी थी उसी तरह एंजियोजेनिक सेल क्लस्टर्स बनेंगे, कार्डियोजेनिक एरिया में एंजियोब्लास्टिक कॉर्ड्स बनेंगे, that is solid cords of cells are formed, and then there is spaces appear between these cells and they form two tubes, one on each side, and they are the initial endocardial heart tubes। जो कि आपको इस फिगर में नजर आ रहा है, ये ट्रांसफर सेक्शन है, ये वर्टिकल सेक्शन है। ये जो दो ट्यूब्स हैं, these are the two heart tubes। Initially these tubes they are solid and they are called the angioblastic cords। Later when they become canalized, they are called the endocardial heart tubes। अच्छा, the blood flow in the developing heart can be visualized by Doppler ultrasonography in the 4th week of development। और अगर आपने कहीं अल्ट्रासाउंड देखा हो तो जब वो फीटल अल्ट्रासाउंड करते हैं प्रेगनेंसी के लिए, तो डॉपलर डालते हैं तो हार्ट फ्लो भी आपको नजर आता है और हार्ट की साउंड भी आपको सुनाई देती है। नेक्स्ट स्टेप इज द फ्यूजन ऑफ द हार्ट ट्यूब्स ड्यू टू लेटरल फोल्डिंग। अब ये फोल्डिंग वाला प्रोसेस 4th वीक में जनरल एम्ब्रियोलॉजी में आपको पढ़ाया गया होगा, फाउंडेशन मॉड्यूल में पढ़ाया गया था कि नहीं?
Yes, sir.
Now, the embryo is a flat disc, slipper-shaped disc, up to the 4th week। In the 4th week, it begins to fold laterally and craniocaudally, and the flat disc is converted into tubular structure। Now, when the lateral folding occurs, these two heart tubes they are brought together they fuse with each other. And now this structure which you see in the, these are the steps that due to the lateral folding, the two heart tubes, they come closer to each other, they fuse, and they form a single heart tube. Within the heart tube, there are the primitive cells. This is the endocardial heart. Around it is the cardiac jelly. And the cardiac jelly plays an important role in the differentiation of the different chambers of and the development of the heart. Now, as the heart tubes fuse, external layer of primordial myocardium is formed by the splanchnic mesenchyme. Intervening between them is the cardiac jelly. This is an acellular substance. The endocardial heart tubes form the endocardium. The cardiac jelly disappears. The myocardial mantle forms the myocardium. Then the epicardium develops from the coelomic epithelium or the sinus venosus and spreads over the heart. डेवलपमेंट ऑफ बॉडी कैविटीज में मैंने आपको बताया था कि बॉडी कैविटीज बनती हैं तो उसमें देयर इज लाइनिंग, एपिथेलियल लाइनिंग, जो कि उसमें बनाती है कार्डियक कैविटी जो बनती है उसमें इट फॉर्म्स द कवरिंग ऑफ द हार्ट. क्या कहते हैं उसको? हार्ट के ऊपर जो मेम्ब्रेन होती है, पेरिकार्डियम. So actually that is the coelomic epithelium which forms the pericardium, and from that the epicardium develops. That's the outermost layer of the heart tube. The cardiac jelly, now a little bit about this. The cardiac jelly is acellular secretion of the myocardium, and it plays a central role in the septation of the heart. That is the division of the heart tube into different chambers. And during the early stages of the development, the cardiac jelly comprises most of the thickness of the heart wall. As the heart differentiates, the cardiac jelly disappears, and myocardium soon accounts for the major proportion of the heart wall. अब अगर आप पिछले डायग्राम में देखें, सबसे अंदर आपको फ्लैट सेल्स नजर आ रहे हैं. दिस इज द एंडोकार्डियम. इसके बाहर जो आपको नजर आ रहा है जो पिंक कलर का है, दिस इज द कार्डियक जेली. और सबसे बाहर जो है तो दैट इज द मायोकार्डियम. नाउ later on this jelly will disappear and this endocardium will be in direct communication with the myocardium. And on the outer side, the coelomic epithelium, it proliferates and grows over its outer surface to form the epicardium. This is another figure which shows the fusion of the tubes. You can see the right and left heart tubes, and due to the folding they come closer, they begin to fuse. And the fusion, initially it's in this tubular fashion, later on the fusion is complete, and then it has different parts which I am going to explain in the next slides. The heart begins to beat by day 21 or 22. Initially the circulation is ebb and flow resulting due to the peristalsis. अब ये initial tube जो बनी है, अभी इसमें there is a peristaltic movement. ये नीचे वाला जो end है, this is the venous end, और ऊपर वाला जो है, this is the arterial end of the heart tube. So there is a peristaltic movement from below upwards, and in this peristaltic movement propels or pushes the blood from the venous end to the arterial end. And at the arterial end there are the aortic arches which communicate with the dorsal aorta. The aorta is not directly attached to the developing heart initially. It is through the aortic arches through which the heart communicates with the dorsal aorta. And by the end of the 4th week, coordinated contractions of the heart result in unidirectional flow of blood. Now, when the heart tube is formed, alternate constrictions and dilatations appear, and if you study it from above downwards, that is from the arterial end to the venous end, the first structure what you see is the Truncus Arteriosus. And the Truncus Arteriosus, then the aortic arches, they arise from the Truncus Arteriosus. At the lower end of the Truncus arteriosus is somewhat conical structure, and the dilated lower part of it is called the bulbus cordis. Then below the bulbus cordis, there is a dilated chamber which is called the ventricle. This is a common ventricular chamber. And below that, the lowermost part, which is receiving the venous blood, is called the primordial atrium. And the primordial atrium receives venous blood through the sinus venosus. Sinus venosus receives the venous blood from the three sets of veins which I described earlier. That is the common cardinal vein, the umbilical vein, and the vitelline vein. This is the primitive heart by day 23, as you can see it on day 23. Then circulation through the primordial heart, initially it is peristaltic. Blood flows from sinus venosus, the opening of sinus venosus into the common atrial chamber, and then it is guarded by the sinoatrial valves. Then from that it goes to the ventricle. Actually, the common atrial chamber, at this stage there is no actual atrium. It is the sinus venosus has two horns, and the two horns unite together to form a single chamber, and that single chamber is labeled as the primitive atrium. Now the sinus venosus receives the venous blood, it passes into the common atrial chamber. From there it goes to the ventricle. The flow of blood from the sinus venosus into the ventricle is guarded by the sinoatrial valves. The constriction which you see at the junction of the sinus venosus and the common ventricular chamber. Then from the ventricle it goes to the bulbus cordis and the Truncus Arteriosus. Again, there is a constriction between the two, and that constriction is called the atrioventricular canal, the constricted part. And from the Truncus Arteriosus, blood goes into the aortic arches, and from the aortic arches into the dorsal aorta. Now, I said that there is folding of the embryo in two directions. One is cephalic and the other one is the caudal. This is the unsplit mesenchyme at the cranial end of the embryonic disc. And आप अगर फिगर ए की तरफ देखें तो सबसे ऊपर जो आपको नजर आ रहा है, that is septum transversum. Within septum transversum you see the developing heart tube. इस फिगर में आपको एक नजर आ रही है क्योंकि ये ट्रांसवर्स सेक्शन है, क्या कहते हैं, वर्टिकल सेक्शन है एम्ब्रियो का. वैसे दो ट्यूब्स होती हैं, फिर लेटरल फोल्डिंग की वजह से दो ट्यूब्स आके आपस में फ्यूज करती हैं, जिस तरह मैंने आपको बताया था. Right now we concentrate on the effects of the formation of head fold on the developing heart. अब इस जगह आप इनके रिलेशंस को आप देखें कि सबसे ऊपर जो है तो सेप्टम ट्रांसवर्सम है. सेप्टम ट्रांसवर्सम will later contribute to the formation of the thoracoabdominal diaphragm. G? It will contribute to the development of the thoracoabdominal diaphragm, plus it will contribute to the development of the part of the pericardium. This is the space, the pericardial cavity. जो हमने कहा था कि जी initially there is one body cilium, then it is divided into three compartments: the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity, and the peritoneal cavity. ये वो जो पहली division थी, the pericardial cavity, इसमें आप देखें कि heart tube is located anterior to the pericardial cavity. Or below the developing heart, you have the oropharyngeal membrane or the buccopharyngeal membrane. So from above downwards, septum transversum, developing heart, and the buccopharyngeal membrane, and the heart tube is located anterior to the this developing pericardial cavity. Then in the next figure, you can see in figure B that the head fold is coming down, and as the head fold comes down, the relationship of all these structures will be reversed. Reversal में क्या होगा? The buccopharyngeal membrane will become the most cranial part, the septum transversum will become the most caudal part, and the heart tube, which was anterior to the developing pericardial cavity, it will become posterior to the developing pericardial cavity. और ये changes आपको figure C में नजर आ रही हैं. Now the buccopharyngeal membrane has become the most cranial part. The septum transversum has become the most caudal part, and the heart tube in this process, in this folding, the heart tube has become dorsal and the pericardial cavity has become ventral. ये दोबारा वही फिगर है मैग्नीफाइड, जिसमें कि आपको फ्यूजन लेटरल फोल्डिंग ऑफ द embryonic disc leading to the fusion of the two endocardial heart tubes. ये ecophelic folding, this is an animation showing the ecophelic folding and its effect on the relative position of the different structures. अब इसमें अगर इस फिगर में देखें, सेप्टम ट्रांसवर्सम जब नीचे चला गया और उसने डायफ्राम बना दिया, तो उससे क्या हो गया? The lower end becomes fixed now, और अपर एंड जो है जहाँ पे ट्रंकस आर्टीरियोसस है और उससे एओर्टिक आर्चेस निकल रही हैं which are going into the dorsal aorta है. 5 मिनट है. The effect is that the heart tube, it has to grow, it has to increase in length, लेकिन इसका upper और lower end जो है they are now fixed. It cannot grow in elongate in this direction. So what will happen? जब आप एक चीज है जिसको दो एंड से आपने फिक्स कर दिया और आप उसकी लेंथ इंक्रीज करते हैं, तो इट इज गोइंग टू बेंड. सो द हार्ट ट्यूब आल्सो बेंड्स, और आप देख लें तो ये इट बेंड्स इन समवट एस शेप पैटर्न. अब इस सारे प्रोसेस का ये जो फोल्डिंग होगी, एंड रिजल्ट क्या होना चाहिए? अब इसमें आप देख लें इस फिगर में, the venous end is at the upper end, the arterial end is at the upper end, the venous end is at the lower end. The ventricular part is superior and the atrial part is inferior. लेकिन जो adult heart है उसको अगर आपने देखा हो, the arterial and the venous ends they come to lie at the same level, plus the arterial part, it is posterior and the ventricular part is anterior. ये आपको मैं दोबारा इस पे ले जाता हूँ, जो फिगर हमने हार्ट का देखा था शुरू में, the pumping heart. इसको देख के आप अप्रिशिएट करें. अब इस हार्ट को आप देखें, सबसे एंटीरियर पार्ट हार्ट का क्या है? इट इज द वेंट्रिकल्स, द राइट एंड द लेफ्ट वेंट्रिकल्स. बिहाइंड द वेंट्रिकल्स आर द एट्रिया, और फिर जो इसका वीनस एंड है which is the superior and inferior vena cava and the pulmonary trunk, ये pulmonary trunk है. और इसके अलावा जो है तो इसका जो arterial end है, that is the aorta, they lie at the same plane, and this is what will be achieved. जो नजर आ रहे हैं फोल्डिंग के, पहले ये एस शेप बनता है, फिर इसके बाद जो है तो आप देखें जो पोजिशनल चेंजेस आती हैं, the venous end it is going posterior, the arterial and the ventricular end is coming forward. The after going through this series of changes, at the end you have the venous and the arterial ends at the same level. Atria जो है तो ये posterior चले गए हैं, ventricles जो है तो वो anterior आ गए हैं, and this is because there is increase in the length of the heart. The upper and lower ends they are fixed. The heart tube cannot elongate in a vertical direction, so the elongation